When Walter Lord was 10 years old, he persuaded his family to go abroad on the Olympic, the sister ship to the Titanic, so he could learn more about the lost liner that sank in the North Atlantic in 1912. Since then, he has devoted a lifetime of research to this ship, having met and corresponded with survivors, rescuers, relatives of victims, and others associated with this great sea tragedy. Today, we call him the undisputed authority on the Titanic and the terrible night of 1912, April 14th. He has written 2 books about this subject, and he is here today on the anniversary of the sinking to discuss the Titanic, which for many will always be a night to remember. Mr. Ward.
I always hope these gadgets work, but I'm afraid on one of the days I may blow up before my entire audience. Wire and sound. Well, just 20 minutes before midnight, April the 14th, 1912, the great new White Star liner Titanic, making her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York, struck an iceberg in the cold black waters of the North Atlantic. She brushed the berg so gently that many on board didn't even know it or notice anything, but so lethally that she was instantly doomed. Technically, she had been labeled unsinkable. By midnight, as we move into April the 15th, Captain Smith knew the worst, and he ordered the lifeboats lowered. There were distressingly few of these, enough for only a third of the people on board. The rule was, of course, women and children first. At 12:15, she radioed her first distress call. At 12:45, she began firing rockets. But there was a light on the horizon, tantalizingly near. This other ship did nothing. By 1 a.m., the Titanic's bellboys, lads of 14 and 15, were bringing up from the kitchen loaves of bread in the Titanic's boats. They were now dropping one after another into the city, rolling off into the night. Far below, the engineers kept the lights burning. And topside, the ship's band played cheerful melodies as the people emerged from their cabins and went toward the boats. The ship was now sharply down at the bow. By 2, the last boat had been launched, leaving 1,600 people stranded on the decks with no place to go. The band still played, and the lights still burned. At 2:17, the Titanic slowly, almost majestically, stood on end. The lights went out, came on again with a single flash, and then went out forever. Through the dark hours, there sounded a great wrenching of metal, accompanied by 3 or 4 muffled explosions, suggesting the ship was breaking up in the dark. Finally, at 2:20, the Titanic leaned back slightly and slipped beneath the sea. Over 1,500 people were lost in this, the greatest sea disaster in history. The water closed over her 82 years ago today. Understandably, the catastrophe was a sensation at the time. The morning after the rescue ship Carpathia reached New York with a pitiful load of 705 survivors, the New York Times devoted the first 12 pages to the disaster. But a single letter I found in the Library of Congress gives, I think, a more vivid picture of the universal shock and horror and grief than any number, greater picture than any number of newspaper pages. The letter is from a young naval officer, Lieutenant Alexander McComb, to his mother. It is dated April the 16th, 1912, and describes what happened as he emerged from a pleasant evening in the theater. The terrible news about the Titanic reached New York about 11 o'clock last night, and the scene on Broadway was awful. Crowds of people were coming out of the theaters. Cafes were going full tilt. When the newsboys began to cry, "Extra, extra, extra, the Titanic sunk with 1,800 aboard." You can't imagine the effect of those words on the crowd. Nobody could realize what had happened. And when they did begin to understand, the excitement was almost enough to cause a panic in the theaters. Women began to faint and weep, and scores of people in evening clothes jumped into cabs and taxis and rushed to the offices of the White Star Line, where they remained all night waiting for some glimmer of news or hope. Understandable then, but 82 years have passed, and we don't even cross the ocean the same way now. One might suppose that people would no longer be gripped by the Titanic. Not so, she has never been more with us than now. In a very real sense, she has proved to be far more unsinkable than her owners ever claimed. What is the hold of this long-lost liner? Why are we still so fascinated by it? First of all, the Titanic is, I think, the greatest news story of modern times. Think of it. The biggest ship in the world at a time when you had to cross on ships to get over one side of the ocean or another. The biggest ship in the world, proclaimed unsinkable, sailing on her maiden voyage. She hits an iceberg, and on a calm, clear night, goes down, taking with her many of the most best-known personalities of the day. Add to that glamour all these if-onlys. If only she had paid more attention to the warning she had received. If only the last warning she received had even reached the bridge. If only her wireless operator had brushed off one final attempt to warn her she was heading for trouble. If only she had sighted the ice a few seconds sooner. Then she would have missed it altogether. If only she had struck the ice a few seconds later, or sighted the ice a few seconds later, she would have hit head on, and there would have been forward two compartments would have been flooded, but no more, and the ship would probably would have stayed afloat. If only there had been enough lifeboats. If only the ship on the horizon had come. If only, but they all went against it. It was a classic Greek tragedy. For nautical enthusiasts, the Titanic is also the ultimate shipwreck. Everybody gets a chance to second guess. Could she have covered the bird with greater facility of lookout if she had had a better lookout? Could she have seen it in time to miss it? There might have been flood in a few compartments, but counter-flooding, would that have helped a little bit? Why weren't rafts and more life-saving apparatus improvised on the spur of the moment? People seem mesmerized. For the social historian, too, the Titanic has special meaning. She is such an exquisite microcosm of the Edwardian world. She pointed up so perfectly the class distinctions that prevailed at the time. You don't need to dig that deep, bring in a historical social study. Just scrape the surface and see what fascinating nuggets you will find that convey a feeling of the period and the class distinctions. I was looking through some of the passengers' insurance claims the other night and ran across the list submitted by Mrs. Charlotte Codeza of Philadelphia. Her luggage included 14 trunks, 4 suitcases, 3 crates, and a medicine chest. Among other things, they contained 70 dresses, 10 fur coats, 38 large feather pieces, 22 hat pins to keep them in place, 91 pairs of gloves, and innumerable trifles to amuse her, like a little Swiss music box in the shape of a bird. Compare this with the Irish immigrants in steerage who owned little more than the clothes they had on their backs. The Titanic is also a trivia lover's dream. Which smokestack was the dummy? What was the painting that hung of the smoking room over the mantel? What was the name of John Jacob Astor's Airedale? I confess I play this game along with everybody else. For years I had a running argument with an English friend of mine over the question of whether the Titanic had a yellow stripe along her side, the side of her hull. He said no, she didn't, and I said yes, she did. Like the other White Star ships, there was no reason why it should be any different. He said, but there were differences. And we would argue, and we could bore them. with unbelievably pedagogical conversation. The other night, I stumbled across the answer. I had looked at the ship's rigging plan often before, but this night I caught for the first time an arrow pointing to just the right spot on the hull with the words, quote, 10 1/4 inch yellow stripe. Alas, my friend has passed away, and I never had the satisfaction of showing how I was right. The attractions go on. The Titanic is also a moralist treasure trove. What a source for sermons on overconfidence. It is a mystic's delight. There were omens galore. Take Morgan Robertson's strange prophetic novel, Futility, of 1898. It foresaw in astonishing detail the actual disaster 14 years later. His ship was even named the Titanic. Then there was the first-class passenger R.T. Buck's letter to his sister-in-law, where he said, if the old ship goes down, all my affairs are in top shape. How on earth why did he put that in a letter about an unsinkable ship? Yet none of these reasons are enough. All these elements are always present in the story of the Titanic, but for years, over 40 years, after the disaster, the Titanic lay more or less in limbo. From 1913 to 1953, there were only a single book. There was only a single book published on the subject. In 1954, the year I started my research, there were only 3 books devoted to the Titanic. In this past year alone, however, there were over 20 books, new titles, and the world has blossomed with Titanic historic societies. It's almost, studying the Titanic has become almost a cottage industry. Why this new surge of interest that actually seems to be accelerating? Certainly the explanation is not the publication of A Night to Remember. It may have reminded people of the Titanic, but that doesn't account for this steady level of fascination. Nor does the answer lie in the discovery of the Titanic's wreck in 1985. People are not as intrigued by what the shattered hull looks like at the bottom of the sea as they are by the story of how it got there. Partly, I think, the Titanic is the beneficiary of a new interest in all ocean liners. Now they're gone, people have discovered them. They're a little like dinosaurs, huge, fascinating creatures from another world. Even more basic is the fact that America is currently on a nostalgia binge. The Titanic has somehow come to stand for a world of tranquility and civility that we have somehow lost. Today, life is hectic. Prices are climbing. Quality is falling. Violence is everywhere. In contrast, 1912 looks pretty good. A happier world where a shoulder of land cost 16 cents a pound. In some ways, we're kidding ourselves. The shirt that cost only 23 cents in 1912 was often made by a child who got only $3 a week at the mill where he worked. Harold Bride, the second Wallace operator of the Titanic, made $20 a month. It would have taken all his pay for 18 years to cross the ocean in one duluth stateroom. And those days were violent too. It's easy to forget that in 1912, former President Teddy Roosevelt, running for a 3rd term, was shot and wounded outside a hotel in Milwaukee. TR was perhaps the most popular man in America, yet it didn't save him from a senseless act of a deranged loner. There was social injustice in those days too. To dramatize the struggle for women's rights, Emily Davison, a great feminist, died by throwing herself in front of the King's horse in the 1913 Derby. But in one respect, this period really was different from today. People might argue over how to right today's wrongs, but they were still sure that the wrongs could be righted. In 1912, people had confidence. Now nobody seems sure of anything. Religious fanatics try to blow up the World Trade Center, and no one knows why they did it. the more uncertain we become, the more we long for a happier day when we felt we knew the answers. The Titanic symbolizes that era, or more poignantly, the end of it. And the worse things get today, the more we think of her and all that went down with her. Whatever the explanation, I can attest that interest in the Titanic is booming. All the old legends are alive and well. There are tales of fabulous treasure to be found aboard the sunken hull. 29 pouches of diamonds worth $300 million, according to one tantalizingly exact version. But 2 separate salvage expeditions have found no trace of this glittering hoard. They have brought up 2,600 items, as varied as 600-pound set of lifeboat davits to a third-class passenger Eugene Daly's set of bagpipes, but no sign of the diamonds anywhere. Intrepid armchair salvagers, like myself, have studied the cargo manifesto with great glory, without no greater luck. We know that the Titanic carried 30 cases of golf clubs and tennis rackets for A.G. Spaulding, a cask of china for Tiffany's, a case of gloves for Marshall Field, William Carter's private red Renault motor car, but still no trace of those diamonds. Studying the insurance claims, we even know that Edith Russell, first-class passenger, listed a $2 hot water bottle. But once again, there's no sign of the diamonds. If they were aboard, nobody filed an insurance policy, filed an insurance claim, or even complained. Another legend, the curse of the Egyptian mummy. It brought bad luck to whoever had contact with it, the story goes. Finally, the owner, the British Museum, palmed it off on an American Egyptologist who took it back to New York on, you guessed it, the Titanic. And as if that weren't enough, according to one story, the mummy was considered so valuable that it couldn't be put in the hold. It was stored on the captain's bridge. Neither the salvagers nor I found any trace of the mummy. But what makes me really skeptical is the very idea of Captain Smith allowing an Egyptian mummy to be stored on his bridge. One more legend, the tale of the Titanic's official number. After A Night to Remember was published, I received several letters from Ireland telling me that the real reason the ship sank was the official number given her by those Ulstermen who built her in Belfast. What was the number? It was 390904. Why was this significant? Hold it up to a mirror, my correspondence hinted. I did, and I brought along a mirror today to show you what I found. This is going to take a little trick of placing the number in the right juxtaposition on the mirror, but I think we can do it. And we're certainly going to try. Wait a minute, now let me see. This is it. See, I'll wheel it around, but can you see what it says at all?
No pope.
No pope.
No pope.
This is 390904 in the mirror. It says no pope quite clearly. Of course, when I asked for the official records, I was still game for this. I asked the official records to confirm this brazen bit of impudence, and I found that the Titanic's builder's number was actually number 401, and her registered number was 131428. In the mirror, neither of these numbers say anything at all. My correspondence include lovers of the occult, and realists too. Many have carved out for themselves special niches in the story. There's a man in Wisconsin who thinks that the Titanic was under-ruddered, meaning that the area of her rudder was too small. He's made interesting comparison figures with other liners of the time, and will submit them without even a drop of a hat. A man in Toronto has developed a theory that counter-flooding, reopening some of the watertight compartments so that the ship would sink evenly rather than by the bow, might have helped. I'm not so sure that would have been a very safe precaution to have taken. She might have gone down even faster. A boy in North Carolina is painstakingly putting the passengers into their proper staterooms. A final example is a Dutchman in Holland who has written extensive research that has been put into a form of a book now, trying to trace the movements of a sealer called the Samson, which was in sight, said to be in sight that night. He finds they're hundreds of miles away, but I have no way of proving whether he's right or whether he's wrong, but it's an interesting study he's made. A legal secretary in Sacramento is fascinated by First Officer Murdoch and has been a real Sherlock Holmes in tracking down his family in a remote Scottish village. When this legal secretary arrives in this village in northern Scotland, I think the villagers must feel that at last they've been connected with the real world for a while, because she is deadly serious in her business. So you see, there's a fertile field for all sorts of research on the Titanic. Here are a few of the things I've been digging into. Who christened the ship? The standard answer is no one. The White Star Liner didn't go in for formal launching ceremonies. It just sent her down the waves. Yet J. Pierpont Morgan came all the way to Belfast for the event, and I've also seen the venues for the luncheon and the dinner celebrating the luncheon. They're both most elaborate, and it's hard to believe that nothing was done in those grandstands for which Mr. Morgan had come so long way to sit. All decked out in bunting, everything there, but nobody launching the ship? Maybe, but it's hard for me to believe it, and I'm still plowing away on this one. Who just missed the boat? For 30 years, my mail has been deluged, or bulging anyhow, with stories of people who almost sailed on the Titanic, but for one reason or other didn't. There are so many that sometimes it has seemed that all these people could have filled a second Titanic and gone checking out. At least one case, however, has been documented, and it concerns a trio of men called the Slade brothers. Bert, Tom, and Alfred Slade were all signed on the Titanic as stokers, but they decided to slip ashore for a last wee drop of something at the Grapes, a dockside pub. But they misjudged their timing. Returning, they found the gangplank pulled back and the Titanic easing out into the away from the pier. What seemed rotten luck turned out to be the best of good fortune 5 days later. And I've often wondered whether the Slade brothers made the most of their new lease on life. Another intriguing question: as the Titanic left her pier at Southampton, the suction from her propellers almost caused a collision with the American liner New York. Did that make any difference? Certainly it made her an hour late in getting to Cherbourg and also leaving Queenstown the next day. Was she still running an hour late when she struck the berg? Clearly, if she had passed the same spot an hour earlier, that particular berg wouldn't have been there, for the ice was drifting south with the current. Then there's the all-important question: why didn't the Titanic slow down when she knew she was in the vicinity of ice? After all, Captain Smith had received at least 4 different warnings during the Sunday before she struck. The usual answer is that he thought she was unsinkable, but surely he didn't plan to hit an iceberg just to prove that. Actually, the evidence indicates that Captain Smith thought he was taking every precaution. Before retiring, he spent half an hour on the bridge going over the ice problem with Second Officer Lightoller. They agreed it was a shame that there was no breeze. A berg stands out better at night if there are waves washing against it. But they finally decided that the night was so clear that she could still avoid anything that she happened to sight. Did Captain Smith think the Titanic could turn sooner than was actually the case? Most of his career had been spent in far smaller ships, which answered the helm much more quickly. The Titanic had only 1 day of sea trials. It seems incredible for such a big ship worth so much from such an important mission should have only been tested for 1 day. In fact, the turning trials were so abbreviated that on their way from Cherbourg to Queenstown, their final stop before heading out across the Atlantic, there was so little time that she practiced making turns all the way from Cherbourg to Queenstown. This was no time to start practicing. How much of this, of the ship and the way and her ways and her responsiveness to the helm, how much did this old sea dog really know about this great ship under his feet? Were there any other circumstances that might have contributed to a delay in sighting the bird? The two lookouts, Fleet and Lee, were completely clear, but old-timers tell me that it was awfully difficult to be at the peak alert near the end of a watch, particularly one in the long and bitter cold. Here only 20 minutes remained, then blessed relief, hot tea, and a cozy bunk. Could human nature have played a part in lulling these men to a slower sighting than otherwise? And what about the orders given the iceberg when the iceberg was reported? First Officer Murdoch was in charge on the bridge. He turned the ship hard to port and reversed his engines. An extremely prominent naval architect who has studied the case tells me that these are two measures that are counterproductive. A hard turn lessens the effect of going full speed astern. Full speed astern lessens the effect of a hard rudder. Doing both could weaken the response of the ship. What did the iceberg do to the Titanic? Most students, including myself, have always felt the bird ripped the hull for some 250 feet, carrying open 5 compartments. But evidence indicates that 16,000 tons of water entered the shattered hull in the first 40 minutes. To produce this result, the hole had to be 12 square feet, no more, no less. But a hole 12 square feet and 250 feet long could only be 3/4 of an inch high. Again, it seems absurd to have a hole of that dimension. Therefore, the water must have come into the ship through other ways besides the gash that was made in the hull. The best bet seems to be a series of sprung plates and popped rivets haphazardly all over the damaged area. That is, a series of stabs and bumps in the berg raised the side of the ship, and the photos by Bob Ballard, the undersea diver who has made some splendid photography, made so many marvelous pictures. His pictures seem to confirm this theory. So much so that I've now officially labeled it the bumpity bump theory. Recent studies have suggested that the steel was brittle and not strong enough, but we can't blame Holland and Wolff, the shipmaker. The steel was state-of-the-art, the highest available in her day. Another question, in abandoning ship, was everything done that could be done? Why were the boats lowered so slowly? On both sides of the vessel, the boats seemed to be lowered one by one, except at the very stern. And why were some lowered only half filled? Why were there only 12 people in boat number 1, which could have held 40? Why was there no effort to improvise rafts out of the hundreds of deck chairs, tables, and benches around? Could the crew have been almost mesmerized by the enormity of the disaster? What role did Chief Officer Wilde play that night? He remains the enigma of the whole story, although he was chief officer. He is added to the crew just before sailing, bumping First Officer Murdoch and Second Officer Lightfellow each down a notch. There's evidence that this did not sit well with either of these officers. Did the sudden addition of this new man, a strange officer, affect the crew's teamwork? Then there's the perennial favorite, what did the band play as the ship went down? Nearer My God to Thee, oddly enough, seems out, although it's supposed to often mentioned. I've never found an account by anybody on board to the end who remembered it. Moreover, the tune in America is entirely different from the tune in England. Yet the story flourished on both sides of the Atlantic. One side must be wrong. And in my book, I opted for the hymn Autumn, because the second wireless operator said autumn, and he was there. But hymnologists tell me that Autumn was so rarely played that it was dropped from the Church of England hymnal in 1916. Moreover, Autumn was the name of the tune, and normally a hymn is known by its words, not by its music. The old ship musicians tell me that whatever the band played, it was undoubtedly something that they were used to playing. After all, this was on a sloping deck in the dark, and by musicians who hadn't played very long together anyhow. They suggest, the ship musicians that I've talked to who seem most knowledgeable, suggest a waltz called Song d'Automne, which was all the rage that season in London. So Song d'Automne, the waltz and not the hymn Autumn, seems more likely than any other if we follow second wireless operator Bride's views. Now for a big question mark. Why didn't the Californian come? She was the nearby ship that lay on the edge of the ice floe, saw rockets in the night, and did nothing. Her defenders usually argued that there was a third ship in between, that the rockets appeared to be coming from the third ship, and that she looked all right, and therefore there was no need for the California to do anything. To me, all this is beside the point. Rockets are rockets. Every officer of the California, including Captain Lord, agreed that these rockets resembled distress signals. And the two men on the bridge, Stone and Gibson, did inspect, the suspect that something was wrong. They reported the rockets to the captain, who was resting below, but he did nothing. All this time, the wireless operator of the California was off duty, sleeping only a few feet away. Weighing in, putting him in his machine would have instantly revealed what was happening from the calls of the Titanic. Sometimes I wish that some magical time machine would transport me back and let me spend an hour any place I wanted on the night of April 14, 1912. I would not spend that hour on the Titanic. I would spend it on the bridge of the California from 4:30 to 5:30 a.m., sharing the watch with Captain Lord and Chief Officer Stewart, who had at that time taken over from Second Officer Stone. At 4:30 was when Stewart woke up the captain and began telling him about the rockets that had been seen on the bridge. Yes, I know, interrupted the captain. He's been telling me. Again, no action, nothing done. But at 5:40, and I'll have to ask the time machine for another 10 minutes, Stewart went to the wireless shack. And the wireless operator was still asleep. It was more than an hour before he was due to be up. But Stewart woke him up anyhow and said that there had been a ship firing rockets, and would the wireless operator check what was going on. Well, you see, if you can find anything, this is Stewart talking, well, you see if you can find anything is the matter. The operator tuned in the California instantly knew the disaster had happened almost within sight and headed for the scene as fast as he could. What happened? What was said? What thoughts were passed or not passed between Captain Lord and Chief Officer Stewart during the hour, which began with the captain still inclined to do nothing, and ended with the wireless operator being awakened and told to find out if anything was the matter? My hunch is that the arrival of daylight was the determining factor. The California was willing to do something with a terribly risky sea, as long as they could see what they were doing. But it has never been definitely decided and never will. I have no doubt that people will come along to work on all these questions. Not long ago, an author gave me a new book of the Titanic that is full of fresh ideas. But what really intrigues me is the fact that this author is a 10-year-old boy. A 10-year-old boy named Freddie, who lives in a remote crossroads village in Arkansas. How did Freddie ever hear about the Titanic to begin with? And what intrigued him so that he went to work with his pencil and crayons and sent me 52 pages of his effort. What could make this expert so interesting? Well, we might as well ask what made another 10-year-old living in Baltimore as it's just so interested back in 1927. My own theory is that small boys get interested in subjects the way they catch cold. Nobody knows how they do it or why they do it, they just do. Flipping through Freddie's pages, I came to chapter 13 called Was It an Iceberg?, in which Freddie suggested that it may not have been an iceberg, but a bomb that sank the Titanic. Whatever the merits of his case, I knew then and there that future research on the vessel would have the benefit of at least one prying fresh mind. I happily said to myself, here we go again, and I could hardly wait for Freddie to come forward. Thank you.
We're going to take some questions and answers right now from the audience. I do need to stop at 11:30. I'll let you know that, okay? So if I need to stop the questions abruptly, please understand. I'll start right here with the gentleman in the purple shirt.
Can you tell us a little bit about the discovery of the Titanic by the divers in 1985?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to tell you one thing about it because they had an illustrated edition of The Night to Remember on board the ship that was doing the salvage. And they identified the Titanic's boiler from the picture in that illustrated edition. And they had been looking back and forth, what's what has happened since the salvage attempts began, which began almost right after the accident. What has happened is that diving equipment, deep sea diving, has just improved immeasurably. For instance, they can scan now the ocean floor in a much wider stretch than they ever could before. And the lighting has become all so much better, and the camera work. I don't know how many of you like cameras and play around with them. I do. And I always feel that I've gotten very fast film if I can get an ASA 1000, which you don't see very often. The ASA rating of the film used in the diving on the Titanic by Bob Ballard had an ASA rating of 150,000, 150 times the power of anything that's commercially available. And that really did more than anything else to the industrial technical revolution. And that's going to go on, you know. We're going to find all kinds of treasure trips and all sorts of things that we haven't, that were completely beyond reach until this was what took place. And so that was what really happened out on the diving in 1985. They would find it sooner or later with the equipment they had now, no matter whether they had found it that particular time or not. But Bob Ballard certainly was the imaginative explorer who put it to good use. Yeah.
Next one. Gentleman in the back holding the book.
I wonder if you care to comment on an original copyright 1912, The Sinking of the Titanic, L.H. Lewis, 1912, which I first saw, and I've seen it before, but in 1916.
Is that the yellow book?
The yellow book.
Oh, it is the yellow book.
Yeah.
Well, that was one of a number of books that came out very soon after the disaster. Was sold not in bookstores, but in by door-to-door salesmen. They would walk with a dummy of the book, and then you would order it through them, and it would eventually come in the mail. I have several copies of the book itself, and also of the order book, which is sort of the model of the book. They aren't very accurate because they were written so fast, put out so fast, that actually they often chapters contradict one another because they use newspaper stories and a stapler more than a typewriter to figure out the book.
That sounds proper because my grandfather lived in the country, and he probably bought it from a traveling book.
He could well have, because that was the way they're sold. I had some of the order books as well as that book itself. But it makes the whole series of about 6 or 7 different books being sold in competition with each other. Some of them were by the same author under different names. So it becomes very complicated. That's what happened.
Gentleman back here holding the pen.
Mr. Chairman, I'm a visitor to your company. I was born, raised and educated in Belfast, Northern Ireland. My grandfather worked in Harland Wolff Shipyard. He worked on the building of the Titanic. There is one question that comes to my mind constantly because I'm an Irishman, and it is the manner in which the Irish immigrants were treated in steerage. They were blocked off from the rest of the ship. There were iron gates used to keep them even from seeing the food or anything that the rich ate. And consequently, when that vessel went down, The Irish immigrants and dozens of Irish children went down like cattle, and they had nothing to save them. Very little has been written about that in any of the books of the Titanic.
I tried to cover it in a chapter called What Became of the Goodwins, and a book I wrote after 1900 called The Night Lives On. And it's perfectly true what you say, that a lot of the third-class passengers were not allowed on deck, whether they were Irish or not, were not allowed up on the boat deck because there was fear of panic and other business. There's no explanation, no excuse for it. There's an explanation for it, of course. Where you see it come through the most often is whole families of 6 and 8 children that were on board the Titanic with their parents. And the parents refused to leave the children, so they all stayed together. And any passengers of the Titanic, if you go down to third-class passengers embarked at Belfast, you'll find a great many of half a dozen so of different families, where everybody in the family went down together.
Gentleman in the back in the white shirt.
Yeah, I came here today because I wanted to say thank you to you, genuine affection for some of the best fantasies of my childhood. I read it, I can remember when I was 10 years old, and I can still remember sitting in the tub and pretending my knee was the iceberg. And sinking very slowly. And, thank you very much for all of us who read it when we were 10 years old.
You know, you're not so far away from myself. In those days, you could buy toy ships, toy ocean liners. I used to buy them and knock holes in the hull and take to my bathtub with them and sink my eyes to the level of the water to watch the ship. So I guess we all did the same thing.
Sir, there's an artist up in Michigan, Jim Clary, who did Bowshot, who did an awful lot of research for about 2 years before he painted this painting. The original went for $50,000 about 15 years ago. He even went to the University of Michigan, figuring that 2 hours after impact and where the stars would be and everything else. And I just wonder if you've ever met him. He did the drawings for the plane that went down there to picture.
I've never met him, wish I could, but on the business of getting the stars just right, you can get it right at some point of the night, but the ship was corkscrewing around very slowly, but it was turning. And I often wondered whether the painters that wanted to be so accurate, whether they ever had an opportunity to see how the stars were fixed at the moment when they were depicting, rather than any other way, because the ship did not just stay still. It was drifting around. The stern was drifting gradually to the south, and the bow pointing to the north. It's awfully hard to know what the star constellation would look like, except you could certainly could get it turned for some point. Whether it was the point that the picture was painted or not, I don't see how anybody will ever know.
Thank you.
Sure.
Over here in the purple dress.
The book about the Titania that was written, is that the name of by Robin? Have you read that?
The Titan by Morgan Robertson, I think he means.
Yeah. Have you read it?
Yes,
What
I have.
similarities did you find? What kind of an explanation do you have?
Well, I have no idea what the explanation is. There was a Dr. Ryan at Duke University who read, and I can remember when it came out, and he wrote and asked me for all the explanations I could give, because he specialized in extrasensory perception and some of these particular sciences. And he did some of his work too. He asked me what I could give him about the Morgan Robertson novel. I gave him what I could, and he wrote back, almost offended, and said, it was a complete coincidence. Why was I trying to palm it off on him?
Mr. Hunt.
I would just like the audience to know that he is not just an expert on the Titanic, but he is a real Civil War buff. And he can speak to us just as much on the Civil War as he can on the Titanic.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I wanted to share with Mr. Lord that I'm a teacher from Hillsborough High School in Tampa, and each semester my college reading class studies A Night to Remember as part of their reading assignments, and we have a Titanic reunion where they dress up as characters from the ship and study these people and come in costume and present their narrative about what happened to them and the things that they did, and they have a real thrill. We have a British high tea And we have that reunion. Some of the people that survived, some of them went down. We have a great time, and we appreciate very much. They all wish they could be here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it a lot.
We have a question.
Got one over here?
We have one. Go ahead. Hold up.
I've heard that deaf people work building ships before. Did any of you build the Titanic?
What's that?
She's heard that deaf people used to work building ships before. Were any deaf documented building the Titanic?
Any what?
Deaf people.
Oh, deaf people. I really don't know what the hiring practices of Parr and Wolf had been. Certainly they were heavily, strongly Protestant in Ulster. And I would say if I was a Catholic shipyard worker, I could definitely claim that I was cheated out of a job. But I don't know about deaf people at all. That's very interesting that you found that. It might be difficult to get commands across in those days with the pre-electronic hearing aids. I wish I knew we could help them.
The back to the future.
Mr. Lord, movies frequently do a very poor job in depicting events such as the Titanic. Two-part question. Have you seen the movies based on the Titanic? And what did you think of them? And number two, did they ever bring you in as a technical advisor to see that everything was right?
There have been several movies based on the Titanic. The one that I'm familiar with is called A Night to Remember, the same name as my book has. And they did indeed bring me in as a consultant, and I had a wonderful trip to London to work with the people at J. Arthur Rank who was making the film. You know, I learned, I don't know much about the world of Hollywood and show business. I was a writer sitting there slipping away in my attic with my typewriter. But I learned that there are better jobs than an author in the world. I learned it when I went over to help as a technical consultant. Technical consultant on a movie that's meant to be factual is really just a cross between a fellow who's paid to be on hand to make the place look good and make the producer look accurate, but he's really being paid to be rude, and a technical consultant must never agree with anything that's on. Then he gets promptly overruled, and then he comes back. I had a lovely time being a technical consultant. I was only a paid per diem worker, but I loved it. So I did work on the film after a fashion. I did complain enough to be considered to have done my job.